Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Springer. I'm the interim dean for the College of Liberal Arts at St. Cloud State University, one of the colleges and that partners in the faculty research group on immigrant workers and is one of the many contributors to this wonderful conference. And I want to be another voice among many that you will experience over the next few days that welcome you to our campus and welcome you to this third annual conference. I want to first and foremost extend to you a great thanks for attending the conference and participating in the afternoon lunch today, but also the number of panels that will occur over the next few days. I'd also like to, as you see scrolling by you up here on the screen, put out a very warm thank you to all of the sponsors, the folks who help put on this event, and who contribute both as academics, but also as community members and community engaged groups that help present a variety of perspectives on this particular range of topics. And most proudly, I would like to also thank the work of the faculty research group on immigrant workers here at St. Cloud State. Some of those faculty are within the College of Liberal Arts, and I, among many, are certainly proud of their accomplishments as a group, but also the organization and presentation of this conference. And so with that, I want to keep my remarks short, and I know that you are going to have a wonderful keynote address here shortly. And I'd like to have you join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Stephen Fillion, who is one of the members of not only the faculty research group on immigrant workers, but really the engine behind putting this conference together. And he will introduce our keynote speaker. But with that, please help me welcome Dr. Fillion to stage.
Hi, yes, my name is Stephen Fillion. I'm the director of the faculty research group on immigrant workers in Minnesota. And as Dean Springer was saying, it's a great honor to have all of you here and once again have a packed crowd at our keynote lecture event. And this is the first of 3 days of events, of course. And so please take a careful look at your brochures and think about coming to some of our other very dynamic and exciting panels and keynote speakers that we're going to have. I would like to make a special mention of one that's going to be off campus coming up, and that's going to be the David Bacon lecture, who's going to be speaking on the political economy of criminalizing immigrants in the United States. And he'll be speaking at the St. Cloud Public Library at 6 p.m. tomorrow night. I have less than I anticipated I was going to say in my introduction to Ruth, because I just noticed that I have left behind the little statement that I prepared for her introduction. Fortunately, that's okay, because I'm familiar enough with her very important work. I've been reading her work on labor and also on gender issues, with a special interest in the question of women workers for now over, well, I hesitate to say it, I guess almost 25 years. And ever since I was an undergraduate student, actually, I've been reading her work and been very influenced by her thoughts on questions of working class activism, especially as they relate to women workers. But most recently, she has, I shouldn't say most recently, probably now for over a decade or longer, she's been taking a special interest in the question of immigrant workers and the role of immigrant workers in the U.S. labor movement. And I appreciate especially this kind of approach to the question of the role of immigrants in American society, because it's one that emphasizes them as not mere victims, but actually as active agents of social and political change in this country. And that's not something new for immigrant workers of this generation. That's actually one that's been the history of immigrants as workers in American society now for over 300 years. In any event, I'd like to make one special note of a talk that she'll be giving tomorrow, not here, but at one of our co-sponsors at College of St. Ben's and St. John's tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at Gorky Hall. She'll be speaking on the topic of gender and jobs in the recession and the Great Depression. Oh, yeah, right, it's not tomorrow night, that's the David Bacon talk. So tomorrow night, or Wednesday night, she'll be giving this talk at St. Ben's and John's. And again, it'll be at 7 p.m. So anyone who has an interest, especially in the question of women and labor issues, would be well advised to go to it, and it'll be very interesting for sure. No, I just wanted to make one more note. One of the reasons why I'm very excited to have her here is because I've also used one of her many books, including L.A. Story, Immigrant Workers, and the Future of the U.S. Labor Movement. And that happens to dovetail very neatly, of course, with her topic today, which is immigrant workers and the future of the U.S. labor movement. So, with no further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Dr. Ruth Milkman.
Thanks very much, Steve. Let's see if I can find my PowerPoint here. While I'm trying to do that, on your tables, there should be a little flyer that says Labor Studies, and I just want to call your attention to that. Can you help me get to the desktop? I recently left UCLA, which is where I wrote the book that Steve mentioned. I was there for 20 years, and I returned, a refugee from Los Angeles, returned to New York City, my preferred location, although I'm not originally from there. And I'm now part of an operation called the Murphy Labor Institute, which is part of the City University of New York. I also teach in the Graduate Center. And Murphy has a program that might be of interest to some of the students in the room called Union Semester, which is described briefly on the flyer. If you're interested, I can tell you more details later. What it is if you come to New York for one semester, take a couple of courses with us on labor topics, and get placed in an internship in a union or another worker organization in New York City. It's a wonderful program. Students love it. And you can usually get transfer credit for the courses at your home institution. So if any of you are dying to get out of Minnesota, see a big city, this is your chance. Check it out. It's a really good program. If you're interested in these issues, you might find it useful. Also described here, for those of you who are almost done with your undergraduate education, we also have a master's degree in labor studies that might be of interest. And you can do the union semester if you just want to try that out as a graduate student as well. It don't have to be an undergrad, either one. So anyways, I just wanted to make a pitch for that. And then let me turn to the topic of the day. As Steve said, I'm going to talk to you briefly about immigrants in the U.S. labor movement, achievements and future challenges is the title of the talk. What I want to do before getting into the discussion of the labor movement itself, though, is give you a sense of how immigrants fit into the current landscape of the U.S. economy and the labor market, because as you probably are well aware, the U.S. workplace has been transformed quite radically in the last few decades, and the position of immigrants in the labor force is very much related to that set of transformations. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about that, and I'm going to argue that low-wage immigration, there are other kinds of immigration I might note. Some of you may be products of it. There are rich people who immigrate for various reasons. There are professionals who leave their country of birth and come to the U.S. for whatever reason. I'm not really going to be speaking about those groups. I'm going to be talking about working class immigrants. And that kind of immigration is demand driven. That is, it's rooted in demand on the part of employers for low wage labor. That's one reason that unauthorized immigration, or what some people call illegal immigration, came to a near standstill when the economy collapsed in 2007 and 2008, as was mentioned this morning. And then I will turn to the question of the labor movement and argue that immigrants are, contrary to once conventional wisdom, turn out to be highly receptive to organizing efforts when they get the opportunity to join unions or other campaigns to improve their economic situation. However, efforts to do that kind of organizing are quite limited in number and in scale, as I'll explain. And then finally, I just kind of give you a very quick overview of the character of what I call the immigrant labor movement, which includes a number of different segments that are not necessarily what you think of when you think of the labor movement. Some are traditional union type formations, and others are quite different. So that's basically the outline of what I'll try to cover in the short time I have. So let me start with the whole point about workplace transformation. You probably know that the United States economy looks very different today than it did in the early 1970s. There was this period that some people call the Great Compression from roughly the mid-1930s through the mid-1970s, when income inequalities narrowed, when a variety of basic reforms were introduced, like the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. These are all New Deal legislation, pieces of legislation that were passed in the 1930s. The National Labor Relations Act, which is what created the legal right of workers to organize in unions. And then, starting in the 1970s, there was a sort of reversal in the economy, and we started to see trends of union decline, very rapid union decline, industrial decline, the decline of manufacturing work, sometimes called deindustrialization, or often linked to outsourcing. You probably know that term, where jobs leave the United States for other places, although I might add parenthetically, deindustrialization is actually a worldwide trend. There are fewer manufacturing jobs in the whole world than there were in 1970, but anyway, that's another story. And then deregulation, another very important part of the story that's often overlooked. So the economy was radically transformed, and inequalities grew. I'm sure you're all aware of the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has shone a bright light on that problem of inequality. It didn't just appear this year, though. It's something that emerged over a period of time, and that all these trends began in the mid-1970s. So I could say more about that, but there isn't time. One effect of all this was a rapid deterioration in many jobs, not in the 1% or even the top 30% actually, but at the bottom among working people, we saw starting in the 1970s a decline in real wages. That means the amount of money people take home once you control for inflation as opposed to nominal wages. Benefits started to evaporate. Some of your grandfathers probably had really good pensions. You're not gonna. Sorry, but that's how it is. Health insurance, we're all familiar with the crisis in that arena. So there's this, these were things that people used to take for granted, pensions and health care. And now it's, you're really lucky if you have them. So as these things happen to what were once, more or less mainstream jobs for working people, those who could, US-born workers who could, abandoned jobs that had deteriorated in this way and tried to find other kinds of work. And that's when employers recruited immigrants to fill the vacancies that resulted. Now, I'm generalizing wildly here because different parts of the country are very varied. My own focus in this research was on Los Angeles, which was a rapidly growing part of the country. If I had been looking at a place like Detroit, I wouldn't find that. Immigrants didn't go to Detroit nearly as much because there weren't a lot of new jobs there. But in places where the economy was growing, basically in the Sun Belt and some other areas, I don't really know enough about Minnesota to comment on where that fits into this picture. This is what happened, and immigrants were drawn to these places where employers were looking for cheap labor, essentially. So all these changes, I guess it's obvious, generated very rapid growth in inequality, which has recently become a political issue, but until last year was not really on the radar for a lot of people. And the other thing that happened at the same time was more and more women, now this is a topic I'm not going to talk about much today, but there is this other talk if you're interested in this issue. Maternal labor force participation just means mothers who also have paid jobs. Being a mother is a very demanding job that you don't get paid for, by the way, I can tell you as a mother, but most mothers also work for pay outside the home today. And that means that they need childcare, and the growing older population needs caring as well. So there's been another source of demand for immigrant labor is in those fields: domestic service, elder care kinds of work, nursing home work, things like that. Home health care as well. These jobs used to be done by African Americans, but increasingly African Americans, like US-born European Americans, exited these jobs for better job opportunities, and immigrants began to fill the gap, both authorized immigrants, legal immigrants, and unauthorized immigrants. Some of you are probably familiar with the last major immigration reform in this country, which was in 1986. It was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA. And that had some unintended consequences. You may know that several million immigrants who had no legal status got green cards and so on, got amnesty as it was called at the time through that act. But other things happened too that weren't anticipated. The idea was, of IRCA, was to solve the problem of unauthorized immigration, and it did it for those people who did get status. But meanwhile, actually, unauthorized immigration increased, which was not anticipated by the framers of that law. And one of the reasons that happened is that migrants who used to go back and forth from their home countries to the United States, especially from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, because border enforcement was tightened, decided to stay here permanently, and then many of them brought their relatives through either authorized or unauthorized means. So actually the number of undocumented people in the United States actually increased. And this is very relevant to Minnesota. As demand for immigrant labor spread to more and more parts of the country, at first it was just concentrated in a few gateway cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. It became a national phenomenon. I know you know that here in Minnesota is one of the many places where that had an impact. So we saw this enormous geographic dispersion as well as growth in the overall population until 2008 of unauthorized immigrants. So all this again is happening in the context of these massive changes in the economy. What you could summarize in the term, I like the term casualization, some people say informalization, where work, once organized in a fairly regulated way, and where basic workplace laws like the minimum wage were observed and so on. Instead, you increasingly got this sort of casualization of work. Some of you may have heard Cassie's talk this morning on temporary agencies that employ many Somali refugees here in St. Cloud. That's one example of this kind of thing, where people have no permanent relationship to one employer like used to be the normal thing in the United States, but increasingly more temporary relations to work, not necessarily through a temp agency. They could be a day laborer or whatever, but the formal employment relationship is increasingly tenuous and dissolved, particularly for immigrants. And when I was younger, people used to talk about agricultural work, which is organized in this way, where it's very casual, migrant work, seasonal, etc. And our dream as reformers was to bring agricultural farm workers up to the standards of urban workers. And what's happened instead is that urban workers have been dragged down to the conditions that once were characteristic of agricultural work only. So that's the situation we're seeing in many, many urban industries. Think about restaurant work, for example, domestic work, obviously, increasingly construction work, where casual work has become increasingly normal, where people work by the day, and there are many other examples. Also, large companies that used to hire workers directly increasingly either subcontract the work to smaller companies who then engage in these practices I'm about to describe with very shady kind of relationships with the people they employ, or to temp agencies, or directly to workers. They hire workers on a very ad hoc basis without making any long-term commitment. And so what we're beginning to see is that more and more jobs are beyond the reach of government regulation of the kind that was institutionalized in the New Deal period. From the beginning, as you may know, domestic labor, which at the time in 1935 when in 1938 when the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was the federal law that first created federal minimum wages, was passed. It's a long time ago for many of you, but it's not really that long ago in the grand historical suite. Domestic and agricultural work were excluded from that act. At the time, those jobs were done overwhelmingly by African Americans, and to get the votes of Southern Democrats, that was the deal that was cut. So they were excluded from the outset. Later, some are covered. Another group of people, but domestic workers often are still uncovered by some of these laws. Independent contractors, you know that term? If you work for FedEx, you're called an independent contractor, even though you work for FedEx every day. Some people say those are misclassified independent contractors. They're not covered by any of these laws because they're supposedly working for themselves. The other thing that we've seen is even for jobs that are covered by the law, and I've done a lot of research on this, enforcement has been declining over recent years. The staff of the agencies that are supposed to enforce these laws have been reduced. Funding for that enforcement effort has been reduced. And immigrants are disproportionately affected by this, especially unauthorized immigrants. With some colleagues, I worked on a study that was published in 2009 that, where we surveyed over 4,000 workers in New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and we found extremely high rates of, these were low-wage workers, roughly the bottom 15% of the labor market in those three cities, of employers not paying the minimum wage, not paying time and a half for overtime like the law requires, and so forth. And this is a growing phenomenon, perhaps you've encountered it here. It's not limited to those three cities. That was just where we had the resources to study it. And we found much higher violation rates for immigrants. This has come to be called wage theft. Perhaps you've heard that term. There's a book by Ken Bobo called Wage Theft in America that also documents it in a more accessible way. Our stuff is all numbers, but hers is a narrative of, if you're interested in reading more about this, I recommend that book. This is increasingly prevalent in the United States today. Here's just some examples from our study. These data are from 2008, and this is all on the web if you want all the gory details. So among all our respondents, a quarter, a little more than a quarter, 25.9%, were paid less than the minimum wage. That's a lot of people. People work off the clock. You know what that means? Where if you're, say you work at Walmart is famous for this because they were caught doing it, and there were some lawsuits that got into the front pages of the newspapers. Your shift is from 8 in the morning to 4 o'clock, and then the supervisor says, you've clocked out for the day, and the supervisor says, oh, could you straighten out that eye for me? That's called off the clock work, where you're working, you're not going to pay anything. Right, that's maybe some of you have experienced this. It's very common in retail, actually, not just at Walmart. They just happen to be the poster shop for it. It's everywhere. Meal break violations, there are rules that say you're supposed to get a lunch break for a certain amount of time, but the supervisor might tell you, well, during your lunch break, would you mind taking care of Mrs. So-and-so in room 3? That's a true story from a nursing home. I could go on and on with stories about this, but I don't have time. So, as you can see here, though, just from a glance at this table, immigrants are experience these, and unauthorized immigrants even more so than other workers. Here you can see that again for just the minimum wage violations. Look at the foreign-born unauthorized immigrants, how much higher the rates are, especially for women, for minimum wage violations. Okay, so now I want to go to my big point number 2, which is that all this is demand-driven. You probably know that some employers directly recruit immigrants from south of the border, or did until the recession. There were some famous exposés of this. Tyson is a company that, I know you have some poultry factories around here. I don't know if Tyson owns any of them, but they were sort of caught doing this red-handed with going to Mexico and trying to get people to come here. More commonly, this is done through intermediaries. There are all kinds of, there are all different terms for these folks who recruit immigrant workers for employers. There's also a lot of referral hiring. That means you're an employer and you run a company of some kind that employs a lot of immigrants, and you need somebody else. You don't advertise in the St. Cloud, whatever the newspaper's called here, but instead you say, Jose, you know anybody who needs a job? I got a couple vacancies, and Jose recruits his cousin or his sister or whoever. That's called referral hiring. It's actually really great for employers because the person isn't going to refer somebody who they don't think is a good worker. So it's sort of a free screening and interviewing service. And it's also, well, it has other effects too. Now, this is really important for if you're trying to understand like the kind of dynamics of immigration policy, because you know, there's the official immigration policy in the United States, all the rules and regulations about, you know, how you get a green card and under what conditions you can legally cross the border and all that. And then, again, before the recession anyway, there was the known fact to virtually everybody south of the US-Mexico border and other parts of the world as well, there was a lot of demand for workers in these kind of jobs. And your cousin had one in Los Angeles, and your other, you know, your sister's cousin had one in Chicago, and whatever, and somebody else had one here in St. Cloud. And you could get a job really easily if you could just get yourself here. Well, that too is US immigration policy. That was a real magnet for folks to come here, and mostly people looked the other way until very recently. So sending communities knew that. So you can say those folks broke the law, and technically that's true, but the welcome mat was there for them. And the 11 million unauthorized immigrants who live among us in this country today are mostly products of that fact. So there are formal restrictions on entry, and then there's the informal welcome mat that, again, until very recently was laid out very plain for everybody. Well, so how do people react to all this as this whole process I've tried to sketch, and I'm, you know, really just giving you the broadest strokes, unfolded? One thing that happened is anti-immigrant sentiment grew.
especially among the less privileged parts of the population. After all, they were the ones who used to have good jobs that had now been just, deteriorated into these basically undesirable jobs. Well, maybe Americans, quote, don't want to do that work. You've heard that line. That might be true, but they wanted the jobs when they were good jobs. And there's a certain amount of blame attached to this, not for the employers who transformed those jobs into undesirable jobs, which is really where the blame should go, but people blame the victim. They see these immigrants doing the work and they say, oh, it's their fault that I don't have a good job anymore, which isn't true, but it's a very easy scapegoat for what's going on. This is a cartoon I happen to like from the New Yorker magazine a while ago. It's not about immigration, but I think it is. So this is the chicken and the egg arguing. Because you get this in the, there's a lot of discussion about, for example, African Americans versus immigrants, are immigrants taking jobs, quote unquote, away from African Americans, and, what does that mean for organizing? So the chicken says, I guess it's the egg talking here. Well, let's stop arguing, we're both here now. So that's how I see it, but we could discuss that more if you don't find that convincing. Well, now my assignment is to actually talk about the labor movement, so I'm finally getting there. Organized labor, the unions in the United States, at first also were quite hostile to immigrant newcomers. When I say at first, I'm really talking about the 1980s. But gradually began to shift their position, and that was for a number of different reasons. One, that they saw that no matter what their stance was, immigrants were going to keep on coming to the United States given the conditions economically south of the border and the magnet that was there in the form of jobs, there's no way that the labor movement was going to stop this. So they might as well organize these people rather than complain about their being there. And also they began to see that employers were playing off immigrants against U.S. foreign workers and therefore thought it was a wiser course to actually recruit and organize immigrants and try to bring the standards up rather than complain about their presence. So that's a short, simplified version of what happened. But anyway, by 2000, the year 2000, is exactly when this happened. The AFL-CIO, which had previously been, had a fairly anti-immigrant policy stance on these questions, did a 180-degree turn and endorsed the immigrant rights struggle and argued that comprehensive immigration reform was necessary. And one of the other reasons that this happened is that a few unions started fooling around with efforts to organize immigrants and were successful beyond the expectations of almost anybody. Because the conventional wisdom as undocumented immigration grew in the post-IRCA period, and even before that, was that you couldn't organize undocumented immigrants. Forget it. They're terrified of the immigration service. They're not going to take the chance of organizing, right? It sounds logical. I thought this myself when I first started studying this stuff. But it turns out the opposite is true. Nowadays, if you scratch a union organizer, they'll say, oh, we can organize immigrants, the problem is everybody else. That conventional wisdom has been completely reversed. So I want to spend a little time talking about that, about what it is about this question of so-called organizability. And I've written about this a lot in the book Steve mentioned if you want to know more. So the hypothesis seems plausible on the surface that it would be difficult to organize folks without papers. One reason is, the argument goes, that many of these immigrants have a sojourner orientation, meaning in plain English, they're here, but they intend to go back home. They want to make some money and go back and build a house in their village in Mexico or whatever. And there are people like that. Even people who've been here for 30 years will tell you they want to go back and build a house in their village. But, well, anyway. So if you believe that, why would someone want to take the trouble to organize a permanent organization in their workplace if they're not going to be around to enjoy the results of it anyway? That seems plausible. Another argument you often hear is that immigrants compare even crummy jobs in the United States look good next to what they experienced at home, is the argument, so working in a garment factory in Los Angeles might look really bad to a U.S. born worker, but to somebody from Guatemala, maybe it doesn't look so bad because things are so much worse in their country. That turns out not to be quite true, but it seems right on the surface, right? That seems reasonably logical. And then the main thing is that you hear all the time is fear of deportation or apprehension. This is obsolete already. INS is now called ICE, much more suitable acronym, I guess. So this all makes sense. It seems logical. Again, I sort of bought into these arguments myself when I began the research on this stuff many years back. And that for all these reasons, you would think unauthorized immigrants especially would be unlikely, unwilling to take the risks, which are considerable, involved in union organizing. Anybody here who's ever been involved in union organizing knows that chances are you're going to get fired at least, and maybe worse. All right, well those things aren't completely wrong, those views about what makes it difficult to organize immigrants, but it turns out there are other things that kind of counterbalance them on the other side, and so I want to just list those very briefly too, that make it easier to organize immigrants perhaps than US foreign workers. One of them is social networks. Now this is just as true of immigrants a century ago. Many of us in this room, I bet, have relatives who showed up in the United States from somewhere in Europe in the late 19th or early 20th century, and this point I'm about to make applies to that period of migration too. As Dania Gavacia knows much more about this than I do, but I'm sure she would confirm. People, again, this is working class immigrants. If you're rich, you don't need all this. But if you come to this country with limited resources, which the vast majority of immigrants do, who do you go to when you show up? For help. You go and you stay with a relative or somebody from the same place. Right? It's just normal. Anybody would do that. Someone who speaks your language, literally. Right? Imagine you show up here, you don't even speak English. You don't know anybody. You're in some giant city. You're going to go where you know somebody. So that's going to be either somebody in your family, maybe a distant relative, or maybe a close relative, or maybe just somebody from the same town. And you're going to stay with them for a little while. Maybe you're going to get your first job through them. You're going to maybe borrow some money from them. Those networks are really important. That referral hiring I spoke about earlier draws on those networks. So those networks get embedded in the workplace. When Jose recruits his cousin to work next to him, for the printing factory down the road. That means if there's an organizing effort, that network is there. And that is a huge resource for an organizing campaign. If everybody already knows and trusts everybody else because they were recruited by each other in the workplace. So that's something that actually really facilitates organizing by a union or another organization. Well, this next one is an old-fashioned term. You don't hear too much anymore, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think that at least Latino immigrants, I don't know enough about like the Somalis, for example, who are here, whether this is true for them too. Maybe someone can comment on that later. And there are many other immigrant groups, of course, too. But compared to U.S. foreign workers who are famous for their individualism, at least Latino immigrants, I think, have a much more collectivist worldview, a sense that their fate is bound up with the fate of the ethnic community that they're part of, which you could call class consciousness, an awareness that they're part of a group that matters. And that's another big resource if you're trying to organize in a workplace, that people have that sense of collective identity, because that's what union organizing is all about, is organizing collectively, not like pulling one person up by his or her bootstraps, right? This quote by Unión hace la fuerza means union is power. That's just a quote from one of our interviews, that people just understand that on some gut level in a way that often American workers are more resistant to. The other thing is the very stigmatization of immigrants and the racialization of immigration, the idea that you're really not welcome here, which of course is increasingly the case, brings people together. They have this shared experience of exclusion. And so that also is a source of solidarity sometimes if somebody offers a helping hand, like a union or a worker center or whatever. And then the risk thing. So it's true that it's risky, as I mentioned, to organize. It is. You're likely to get fired. You're likely to have some other negative repercussions. But compared to the risks that unauthorized immigrants have already endured, like crossing the border, it's nothing. Well, it's not nothing, but it's a modest risk. As one Salvadoran immigrant told us in our interviews in Los Angeles, there, in her country, if you were in a union, they killed you. Here, you lost a job at $4.25 an hour. This is an old interview from when the minimum wage was $4.25 an hour. So that sort of says it all. So yeah, there's risk, but it's not, in the grand scheme of things, for this population, the risk is modest. So for all those reasons, there's actually been much more, a highly unanticipated originally by scholars, observers, unionists, employers, much more organizing than one might expect. And nowadays, like I said, the conventional wisdom is that when the opportunity presents itself, which unfortunately in my view is relatively rarely, immigrants are very responsive, probably more so than most US foreign workers. So actually there's been a fair amount of immigrant organizing, although the numbers are quite modest. I mean, or else we live in a different society than we do. So I just want to sketch out, again, this is like hopelessly brief because, there's a lot more to say than I have time for, but 3 pieces of what I consider to be the immigrant labor movement. So one is just traditional trade unionism. I know there's right after this session, there's a workshop that features an example of an SEIU campaign. That's one of the unions that has been most active in immigrant organizing. Unite Here, which is the garment and hotel and restaurant workers union, is another place where there's been a lot. In general, but well, I don't have time to get into this, but the unions that are now part of this federation called Change to Win, which left the AFL-CIO a few years ago, are the most engaged in this arena, but they're not the only ones. Actually, the steel workers are now organizing car wash workers, for example, in Los Angeles and now in New York. So it's not limited to them. But anyway, traditional trade unionism is one form that immigrant organizing takes. Something that, you know, most of us have at least some general familiarity with. We know what a labor union is. But that's not the only form, and it's maybe not even the main form anymore. Because there is this other phenomenon that has mushroomed in the United States, which is organizations that are often called worker centers. I was talking to Steve about this earlier, and he was saying how it's time for St. Cloud to have a worker center, and that might be right from what I've been hearing about this morning about the plight of working people here from other countries. But anyway, worker centers are basically small, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that advocate for low-wage workers in precarious jobs, and those casualized jobs I was describing before. Often they focus on things like wage theft and other legal violations. They offer ESL courses to folks. They offer a variety of social services, and they advocate for people who don't have a lot of resources and who are experiencing, you know, illegal conditions. By the way, those laws that were passed in the 1930s apply equally, with very few exceptions, to unauthorized immigrants and everybody else. They have the same rights to the minimum wage, to overtime pay, and so on as you do and I do. Those laws do not exclude this population. But the laws are violated much more for them, and of course, they have fewer resources to fight back. So these groups, the worker centers, do a lot of that kind of work. And then the immigrant rights movement itself, the groups that advocate for legalization and a path to citizenship and so on, I consider that part of the labor movement, because really, for those 11 million estimated unauthorized immigrants, the main obstacle to economic advancement is lack of legal status. And the quest for legal status is a quest for economic advancement. Why do immigrants come here after all? Okay, some come as refugees, and we've heard a lot about them this morning. Most immigrants come because they want a better life for themselves and their children. They want to move up in the economic hierarchy of the world market, right? And so the quest for legal status is in that sense part of a quest for improved labor conditions. So I consider all three of these part of the labor movement, not just unions. And in fact, increasingly the three interact with one another, and there are all kinds of synergies between them, and they have learned from one another, and that's enriched all of them. The immigrant rights movement doesn't call itself a labor movement. It calls itself sometimes a civil rights movement, sometimes a human rights movement, sometimes simply an immigrant rights movement, but I think it's intrinsically a labor movement too. And now these groups don't always agree with each other, these three segments of where I consider one movement, but like I said, there are synergies among them. There are differences, like the worker centers often started with a fairly strong anti-union sentiment. They thought unions were kind of dinosaurs that didn't really make any sense anymore, and that what workers needed was this new kind of organization. But that's increasingly being rethought. How am I doing for time, Steve? I was going to say more about each of these three strands, but I don't know if I should. 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, let me skip some of this. I'll just say that the immigrant union organizing has brought new energy into a fairly sclerotic labor movement. I guess you all know that the United States labor movement is not exactly thriving in general right now. One of the few pieces of it that is thriving are the segments where immigrants have become involved. They bring new energy and often new tactics into the labor movement, so I don't have time to give you examples of that. Immigrant labor struggles that are about very super exploited immigrants at the bottom of the labor market capture the hearts and minds of the public much better than those of, say, you know, public workers who have what many private sector workers envy because they have pensions and stuff. We've seen struggles about those things too recently in Wisconsin and Ohio and elsewhere. I'm not saying those aren't valid struggles. I support those workers too, but I think most people in the public are much more horrified when they hear stories of people being paid $2 an hour than by those other stories. So this is a high moral ground for the labor movement. Okay, and then the worker centers, just to say there's 200 of them or so right now. I already discussed some of this. They do a lot of grassroots organizing. They're very good at shining a bright light on abuses of the kind I've been describing, but they have very limited resources, and that has gotten them interested in building alliances with organizations with more resources like unions, and so we've seen some convergence between those two pieces of the labor movement. I think I already covered most of this about the immigrant rights movement. Just to say that there was a time when sometimes legal immigrants were not supportive of the struggles of undocumented workers to get status. Long ago this was really, but now that's really rare because there's so much stigmatization of immigrants generally, and most people, it's not like you can see on someone's face whether they're here with papers or without. There are many mixed status households where parents have children once they're here, the parents don't have papers, the kids do, whatever. So it's become one community, and the immigrant rights movement has very strong support in that community. You probably remember, I know they were here in Minnesota in 2006, it was enormous. That was the last time there seemed to be a prayer of immigration reform, 20 years after IRCA. It seemed like it might happen, and then there was this right-wing legislation that almost became law, the Sensenbrenner bill, which got people into the streets in protest. And one of their slogans was, you accept our labor, now accept us. You can find Minnesota on this map, quite easily, right there in the middle, on the top. These demonstrations took place all over the country. So it's just a picture of one from LA. Right, so I'm raced ahead here, now I'm saw up, so there'll be a little time for discussion. So really the points I want to leave you with are three, I think it's three, maybe it's four. One is that immigration and the transformation of the workplace that I described, the widening of inequality, the proliferation of wage theft and other workplace violations, these things are very tightly intertwined. They're not separate. They're very related. Immigration is driven by the transformations of the workplace and by the growth of demand for cheap labor. Organizing is underway, but much more is needed. And just as immigration and workplace transformation go hand in hand, in my view, immigration reform and improved labor standards must go hand in hand. That you can't have one without the other. I mean, it's not going to be effective to improve labor standards unless you also do something about the crisis of the broken immigration system. And so I believe that organizing of the kinds I tried to sketch out for you needs to focus on both of those things, and also needs to create lasting organizational capacity of some kind. I didn't really have time to get into this, but one of the issues for the immigrant rights movement and for the worker centers and other NGOs is that while they're very good at running individual campaigns about particular abuses, sometimes it's harder to form permanent organizations that have the capacity to follow through and bring people up in a lasting way, which is what the unions with all their warts have been best at over American history. So I feel like all these groups need to learn from each other and come together and lift up the conditions of the bottom of the labor market, which is disproportionately foreign born. So I'm going to just stop there. Thank you. I guess we have a little time for questions.
Right, about 10 to 15 minutes before the next round of panels begin, so take questions
Or comments?
or comments or both. Bernie?
Hi, I'm a member of the Food and Commercial Workers Union, and in the last 4 to 5 years, our success has been with immigrants. And what I have found over the years is, one, they have no fear, usually. I've had a group of laundry workers down in Red Wing when they were told that you're going to call ICE when a drive start, our lead person handed the manager a phone and said, go ahead, dial it. I also find that people are here for their families and also because of failed trade policies. I have one plant where we have workers from 15 different countries, and virtually every guy that works in that plant used to be a farmer. So I guess I'm just reinforcing what you put out there, but we are organizing, and that has been the energy that's come back to our locals. The fact the newly arrived have energized a number of our drives.
Thank you. Anybody else? Come on, you got to ask some questions. I squished my remarks at the end, so I'm going for this.
I'm just curious if you've done any sort of historical analysis between what's happening now and what happened. I mean, you talked a little bit about it, but are there sort of numbers or data to back up what's sort of the resurgence of immigrant organizing?
I'm not sure what you're asking, but are you saying, are there earlier waves of labor
Well,
organizing?
no, I
than
mean, the
immigrants?
last time we saw mass organizing of immigrants was in the 20s and 30s post-depression.
Exactly. Well, so think about, so, you know, the biggest wave of labor upsurge ever in this country was in the 1930s. And there's a lot of evidence that that was led by not actually immigrants so much as the second generation, or second, everybody knows what that means, in other words, the kids of immigrants who weren't born abroad themselves, but were born to immigrants. And the irony there is that those unions, in many ways, helped bring about the reforms I talked about and the narrowing of inequality that resulted. I mean, they weren't the only factor. You know, there was Franklin Roosevelt and so on, but he was pressed from below a lot by the labor movement to do all that. And as a result, that generation of your mostly Southern and Eastern European immigrants entered the so-called middle class. In other words, the labor movement was able, through its success, and which is the greatest success ever in American labor history, to lift those jobs up, to win higher wages, benefits, all the rest of it, at least for a couple generations. And that led to assimilation and entering the mainstream of the U.S. economy. And really one of the big questions before us now is, will that history be repeated for this new wave of immigrants? Will they be able to become assimilated and enter the middle class in that way? And I think the jury's out on that. Right now, it doesn't look good. What we see instead is, you know, much wider inequality than we've had since the 1920s. And, well, there is the organizing I described, but it's unfortunately, despite the efforts of this gentleman and many other very wonderful people who are trying to make this happen, the scale of it is still very small. It hasn't gotten to the point where it's anything close to what happened in the 1930s. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including, you know, vicious employer opposition. It's not like people aren't trying. But it's very, very difficult to do. And I sort of feel like, in some ways, the future of, you know, the kind of configuration of the whole society, whether we would have a more egalitarian society again, in many ways depends on whether those efforts succeed, because that's one of the few things you can imagine turning things around. And that is what happened in the 30s. I mean, really, in the early 30s, it was just like today. The 1%, you know, it was the same kind of set of issues. You go back and read that history, you'll see that. And the labor movement was like the most powerful force that helped turn that around. And again, there were others, the Depression being hurt, and we have sort of a version of that now, but much milder. So, I don't know, I mean, you know, there is the old Mark Twain thing about, what is that? Help me, Donna, what is that quote? It rhymes. What is it? Has it rhymes? You know right, sometimes it rhymes. That's right. No, so you can't expect the exact same thing to happen again, but one can imagine something like that, perhaps, transforming things. And I guess I'm personally very heartened by the emergence of Occupy Wall Street, which is not a labor movement per se, but at least it is a movement from below beginning to focus attention on exactly these issues. They haven't particularly worried about immigration, but that focus on the pervasiveness of inequality, which has reached heights, again, not seen for almost a century, you know, it's hugely important for beginning to do something about all this. And if that is addressed, I feel like labor is going to be one of the forces that helps turn things around.
Just a follow-up. You had, not to be too political, but you did mention policy.
You can be political, I don't mind.
Okay, well, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, does the policy have to change before you can see a big wave of organizing, or will the organizing lead to policy change?
I think they go hand in hand, you know. To get policy to change, you need organizing. It doesn't just happen. Like, the power concedes nothing without struggle and all that, right? I mean, that's my view. And so to get policy change requires some kind of grassroots upsurge. Maybe Occupy is part of that. On the other hand, if you don't win policy changes, it's going to be hard to sustain whatever gains are made from organizing. So I see it as a kind of, you know, hand-in-hand kind of thing for myself. And I think that is what we saw in the 30s. And there were sort of huge historical debates about all that and what, you know, who did what and all that. But right now we just need to get that dynamic started at the moment, it seems to me. And again, I feel like the only hope I see out there right now, besides what people like our friend from the OCW are doing, is Occupy. I mean, those are the pressures that are beginning to bubble up. Because things have gotten to the point where I think more and more Americans are really deeply concerned about the future of the country. And, well, that's a starting point. But we've got to build on that. It's not going to just happen.
There's somebody over there.
I was wondering if you could say something about how gender intersected with immigrant workers, organizing.
Well, the one thing there's a lot to say, but let me just make one point about it, which is that one thing that really struck me is the number of leaders among worker centers and other immigrant advocacy groups who are female. So I've been exploring that a little bit in some recent research. Actually, it's sort of interesting. It's not the case in other social movements, like the labor movement isn't like that. Sorry, but it's still largely male-dominated, though there's some exceptions here and there, and the exceptions are in more immigrant-friendly parts of the labor movement, and yet they're all. So what is that about? And I sort of think it's partly to do with the different impact of migration on women and men, and this is like a huge generalization, but it's in the literature. Again, Donna's the expert, not me, but I've read a bunch of this literature which points out that when low-wage immigrants come to the United States, often the experience for men is, as men in their gender, in the gender aspect of their existence, is a kind of diminution of status, that they have more status at home because of a more patriarchal culture. And that's complicated because these things are changing south of the border too, but in general. And for the women, it's the opposite, it's empowering. And just the fact that they must work to survive also gets them out of the house and into the public arena and all that. So I think there's something like that going on. And then what we found, though, in the research, I did this with a woman called Veronica Toritas, who now teaches at USC. She was my student at UCLA before that. We did a bunch of interviewing among the women leaders. And the other thing we figured out is that a lot of them are 1.5 generation. That is, they came here as children and they were educated here. And so a lot of their ideas about political leadership and all came from higher education, where they were exposed to women's studies and things like that. No, really. So there's a certain amount of sort of feminist socialization that goes on. And then men are less likely to have that. You know how women go to college longer than men nowadays? And actually among immigrants, it's even more true that the women tend to be good students because, ironically, it's because their families are so patriarchal and they want to protect the women's sexuality, so they go home, so they do their homework, and the men go to the street and get into difficulties of various kinds. And so, there's one of our interviewers said it, and there's a line like this in that movie, which I love, Gran Torino by Clint Eastwood, where he's talking to the Hmong immigrant next door who says, the young woman, she says, in my community, the girls go to college and the boys go to jail. It's obviously wild overgeneralization, but the's something to it. So anyway, for a lot of different reasons, you see a lot of women in leadership positions, which I think is interesting. On the other hand, for the 1.5 generation, that sort of diminution in status thing isn't really true for the boys either. So the Dreamers, who I think had a panel this morning, which I went to the other one, but some of you heard about the undocumented student movement. I don't know about here in Minnesota. In California, all the leaders are women. It's unbelievable. That's the most extreme example. So there's something there, but that's all I can say right now.
I think we should stop here just so that we facilitate people moving to the panels, which are just next door over in Voyagers and over in Glade.